like to welcome our first keynote speaker to the stage. So Professor Sarah de Rijcke, I'm sure many of you already know. One of the core things that we wanted to look at in On-MERRIT was reform of reward and recognition, because so much of the introduction of these open and responsible research practices comes back to reforming the reward system. And Professor de Rijcke is really one of the most brilliant thinkers that we have on this issue. So Professor in Science, Technology and Innovation Studies and Scientific Director at Center for Science and Technology Studies, CWTS in Leiden. Professor de Rijcke is Chair of the Science and Evaluation Studies Research Group, co-chair of the Research on Research Institute, RORI, founded by Wellcome Trust, University of Sheffield, Leiden University in Digital Science. Sarah specializes in social studies of research evaluation and has published widely on the topic of the relations between quality control mechanisms and knowledge production in different fields. She has also developed a strong international public academic presence with outreach activities in science policy, speaking frequently on the topic of research evaluation and metrics uses. So Sarah, are you there? I will stop sharing.
Yes, I'm there. Thank you for that generous introduction. Let me see if I can start sharing.
Stop.
Good. Yeah, thank you. Also, congratulations on this really excellent project. You called it small, but it's also great in many ways. It's very good in its systems level approach, and also its interdisciplinary approach, and in its ambitions and in its mixing methods. So I really applaud you for that. And I look forward to the rest of the afternoon. And thank you for inviting me. I want to take responsible research assessment and open research together, which I think is necessary and also can reinforce each other. What I would like to do is to discuss some takeaways from current initiatives, and I will zoom in on two initiatives that I'm involved in or have been involved in myself in this talk. One is a project that we're doing together with DORA, the project Terra, and one is the UNESCO recommendation on open science. But I wanted to start with setting the scene, and that is important, I think, because we can discuss the relevance of open research just because it's the way we should do research, but there's also this larger context. So that also positions myself in some of these debates about the merits of open research, I guess. And we've seen many radical changes over the past century, you could argue. On the right, you see a very interesting comment written by Philip Ball. This was right before the pandemic hit us, but he also already alludes to the role that epidemics and pandemics can play in the world. So he describes how science has changed over the past century toward more team research and big science, also toward fulfilling its societal contracts. By confronting issues, well, obvious issues by now, of global reach, and also really existential urgency, as he refers to it. And that also goes to the issue of climate breakdown. And this is interesting, I think, as a comment, because it also signals the links with the important changes to the institutions that underpin research that are already going on, and the changes that are really desperately needed in the area of open research, for instance, but also responsible research assessment. So one of the questions is, can articles, can papers, can monographs still contain the research results of today? That's one big question. Well, most of you would probably argue that there are some limits to that. But it's not only the communication space of the research system, but also the evaluation system at large. Do we think that systems of credit still work and still work to acknowledge the extreme diversifications of roles in research, and also the expectations of what research and innovation should do, or are they actually failing? And you can clearly tell that there's some momentum building here in this area. So especially, I guess, over the last 3 to 5 years, we've clearly seen that not only a smaller group of coalition of the willing, in a sense, but a very large group of different stakeholders have converging issues and concerns over some of the things that I've put on the slide here. It all, I guess, started with major issues of misconduct and fraud, and we were ourselves involved in a lot of the discussion about misapplication of very narrow criteria and indicators of quality or broader relevance. And this misapplication of metrics is deeply connected to problems around research integrity and reproducibility. What we also see, and it should also concern all of us, is this reduction of the diversity of research missions and purposes that comes from this rather narrow application of a set of criteria and indicators. And this leads institutions and researchers also to adopt rather similar strategic priorities, or to focus, for instance, on the more incremental work and lower risk work. Then there's issues many of these initiatives flag around the reduction of diversity and vitality, and also representative legitimacy of the research community. And of course, also a diversion of attention in policy and management to things that are relatively easily measurable at the expense of less tangible and quantifiable qualities. Now, this is a definition of responsible research assessment that we came up with in the context of a report that we wrote for the Global Research Council that looked at the space of funding agencies. And what we had there was this definition. So responsible research assessment is an umbrella term for approaches to assessment which incentivize, reflect, and reward the plural characteristics of high quality research. And all these terms have context and meaning, so it's not flagging the word excellence, for instance. And it's also in support of diverse and inclusive research cultures. And we tried to come up with a definition and an umbrella term that is inclusive, but as you're probably aware, the discussion around responsible research assessment didn't start out this broad. This is a culmination of efforts, I guess, that led to this more inclusive terminology. Oh, this is rather annoying. Sorry about that. I'll put everything up there. I think this is most of it. Yes. So what you have here is a timeline, and also on the lower end of the slide, the drivers for initiatives starting in 2013 with DORA, and then moving all the way up to the right to the UNESCO recommendation on open science. And I've not put everything that has happened in the past 9 or 10 years here, but this gives a flavor of the broadening out of the issues and the drivers. So with DORA and with Leiden Manifesto that I was involved in myself, and also the metric tide, that really focused on this issue of responsible metrics use or irresponsible metric use, and what to do about that. And then you see other issues coming up as well. So also an increasing focus on societal and economic outcomes of research, an increasing focus on institutional missions and local priorities and needs, and also a drive to create more open research and evaluation infrastructures. Open research has been around for much longer, as I'm sure I don't need to tell you, but this is specifically referring to the infrastructure part of that discussion. So if we zoom out a little bit, and we focus on the interface between responsible research assessment and open research. I've put up some guiding principles that also resonate with the UNESCO recommendation. So we really need to make sure, and that is also, I think, one of the outcomes of the On-MERRIT project, that review research assessment and career evaluation systems need to align with these principles of open research. And that is also because we need to acknowledge that a commitment to open research requires time, and it requires actions and resources that cannot automatically be transferred into traditional output, or shouldn't even result in traditional output such as publications, but that can have a significant impact anyway. So how can we facilitate this transition and also facilitate early career researchers or academics, for instance, to move into open research? And I think that we really need a global effort to break the barriers in the way we assess researchers, and also to change the current research culture and to reward researchers for sharing and collaborating and engaging with society. And what makes this difficult is, of course, what does global mean, and how can we also accommodate for relevant, meaningful contextual variation. And another thing that makes it difficult is that we really need a concerted effort. And this is also why I got a sneak preview of the recommendations that come out of the On-MERRIT projects. And what I really like about those is that it also does speak to different types of stakeholders, including funders, and including, of course, institutions and universities, journals, publishers, scientific societies across disciplines, and also society need to step up. So where are we with concrete initiatives, with concrete efforts? Because, well, there are a lot of declarations and manifestos out there, but it's also interesting maybe to see where we stand. And I guess what's interesting about this point in time is how attention is shifting from describing problems toward also designing and implementing solutions. And this is also where we see that the different actors in the systems respond very differently to the initiatives on the previous slides, but also to this larger responsible research assessment agenda. We did some research a while ago about the adoption of the Leiden Manifesto and the metric tide and DORA. We see this as kind of a threesome that goes together often, that tries to tackle irresponsible uses of metrics. And then it's a bit of an overgeneralization, but it's interesting to see the different types of responses. So what we have here first is cosmetic appropriation. So we see that some organizations have signaled support for this agenda, for example, by signing up to DORA or by endorsing the Leiden Manifesto, but not really also taking the vital steps that are needed to actually start applying and embedding these principles in actual policies and processes. And of course, this is a first necessary step to endorse, but we really also need to facilitate this actual emergence of new policies and practices. The second response that we saw was, well, we've referred to that as calibrating the machine. So in some contexts, you see that responsible research assessment and that agenda has been productively applied. But it's the basis of relatively incremental improvements to assessment systems. The recommendations of the metric tide a couple of years ago led to some adoption and incorporation in the REF, the Research Excellence Framework cycle. And it was also a basis for guidance on the use of quantitative indicators across the exercise. And we see a similar type of dynamic in the Netherlands, where also these types of recommendations lead to not huge overhauls, but more like calibration of an existing machinery. Now, the can openers, these are global initiatives leading to can openers to start and spark reflection and debate on why and also how maybe more responsible approaches to assessment should or could be adopted. And this is, for instance, very visible in the Latin American Forum for Research Assessment work, which is fantastic, by the way. And finally, advocacy coalitions. So various alliances and coalitions for change have also arisen as a response to this wider research assessment, responsible research assessment agenda, with the aim also of developing and also applying more detailed guidance in specific contexts. I'd like to discuss in the remainder of the talk two of the initiatives that you could perhaps label as advocacy coalitions, or a bit more than that, the UNESCO recommendation on open science, and this project that I mentioned at the beginning, the Terra project, funded through Arcadia. Let's go to the UNESCO recommendation first. What I think is very helpful about this recommendation is that it is really making clear that this move to open research is taking place on a global scale. And well, UNESCO's almost 200 member states tasked the organization with the development of this international standard setting instrument on open research in the form of a recommendation by UNESCO, because it's the United Nations agency with a mandate for science. So it's seen also as the legitimate global organization to build such a coherent vision on openness, and also to come up with a shared set of overarching principles and shared values. And with three colleagues, I was representative of the so-called Western European and North American states. And in that capacity, I also contributed to writing the recommendation. Okay, so as you can see here, we operationalized the term open science as broad as inclusive as possible, although you could argue about the terminology of open science itself, obviously. So we say that it combines various movements, various practices aiming to make scientific knowledge openly available, accessible and reusable for everyone, and also to increase collaborations and information sharing, and to open the process of knowledge creation and evaluation and communication to societal actors. I'm stressing and evaluation and communication because it's not self-evident that we also open up these boxes beyond the traditional scientific community. We also state that it includes all scientific disciplines and aspects of scholarly practices, including basic and applied, but also natural and social sciences and humanities research. And it builds on a couple of key pillars that I think I have on the following slides. So open access to scientific knowledge, open infrastructures, open communication, open engagement of societal actors, and open dialogue with other knowledge systems. There are also 6 key objectives that you see here on the slides, promoting a common understanding of open science associated with the associated benefits and challenges and diverse paths to open science. Also developing an enabling policy environment for open science, investing in open infrastructures and services, also investing in human resources, education, digital literacy, and capacity building, fostering this culture of open science and aligning incentives for open science. This is where it also links to responsible research assessment, and promoting innovative approaches for open science at different stages of the scientific process. Now, I'd like to zoom in on that 5th key objective in the recommendation. So this is the one that aligns with the incentives. So what we really need, and that is something that I'd stressed before and that I also think is very visible in the On-MERRIT project. So how are we going to do this? By combined efforts of many different stakeholders. But that is what we need to do if we want to break the barrier in how we assess researchers right now, and also how we fundamentally will work towards a different research culture. And also opening up to society and engaging with society. We also recommend to review research assessment and career evaluation systems in order to align them with the principles of open research. And third, we also recommend to promote the development and implementation of evaluation and assessment systems that really also build on existing efforts to improve the ways in which scientific outcomes are evaluated. That, of course, also includes, for instance, the DORA declaration, with an increased focus on quality rather than quantity, and also by using indicators more wide-ranging than journal-based metrics. And that kind of phrasing is maybe on the conservative side if you're in the open research community, but do realize that it's a UNESCO recommendation and that all regions and countries involved have adopted this formulation. So that's quite an achievement, I think. We also recommend that we promote evaluation systems that give value to all relevant research activities and scientific outputs, including high quality fair data and metadata, also well documented and reusable software, protocols and workflows, and also machine readable summaries and findings. So that's not all. I think we also try to make clear that we should promote systems that take into account evidence of impact and knowledge exchange, widening participation in the process, also influence on policy and practice, and engaging in open innovation. And of course, systems that take into account this diversity of disciplines and also different career stages, with a particular attention to people at the beginning of their careers. It further says that the member states should also ensure that the practices of open research are well known and also well understood and standardized elements in recruitment and also promotion criteria. And that all stakeholders are encouraged to adopt policies that really require and reward open access to scientific knowledge. And that we ensure diversity in communications, again, with adherence to the principles of open, transparent, and equitable access. So the next stage, I guess the UNESCO recommendation is going to go in. It was adopted in November 2021, and we now have a couple of years ahead in which implementation of the recommendation becomes really important and crucial. And I'm really looking forward to and also trying to mobilize I guess in the remit that I have, people to see what we can do on national and international levels to also keep bringing this implementation agenda at the front stage. So the second thing I wanted to discuss with you is a project that we're collaborating on, and that's led by Dora. This is called the Terra Project, Tools to Advance Research Assessment. As I think is clear also by now, that responsible research assessment and research assessment reform is really part of the open research movement in academia. And it's part of it because we all ask, I think, the question of who is research for and what is it actually for? And what this project aims to do is that it aims to facilitate the development of new policies and practices for academic career assessment. So it focuses on one slice of the assessment ecosystem in the sense that it focuses on careers and on individual academics. When we take stock of the research assessment reforms, we've seen already that there's some different ways in which recommendations can be adopted. There's also still some controversies and many unknowns, I guess, about what reforms involve, how they should be set up, what results will be, which is, I think, exciting. It's also frightening, and it's very important that we do this carefully and that we monitor and evaluate and experiment and dare to fail. And it's very, I think, hot and happening also in my own country, in the Netherlands, where you see a lot of experiments on the national level with recognition and reward systems and trying to affect change there. I won't go into that now, but I'm happy to answer questions about that if you have any. But there's clearly, I think, also a need for communities of practice and also for common knowledge resources and for shared learning. And this is also one of the clear aims of the Terra project. And it's really, I think, also relevant because more and more institutions begin to examine and also refine their approach to academic assessment. So what this project aims to do is to produce online resources also for those interested and engaged in assessment and in assessment reforms. So it focuses on the policies that are trying to already introduce more responsible forms of assessment. In an interactive online dashboard that tracks criteria and standards that academic institutions use for hiring and review and for promotion and tenure. And we don't track everything. We filter it through this definition of responsible research assessment that I started the talk with. Terra also does a survey of the US context, and that is because well, we could do it in more regions, but we focused on the US context now for the reason that we want to gain a much broader understanding of also the institutional attitude and approaches to research assessment reform there, and also because we think that there's still an open question about the adoption of DORA and responsible assessment criteria in the US. We couldn't do everything in this project, but that is something that we are currently exploring. And then thirdly, we develop a toolkit of resources, informed also and really sourced by and through the academic community to support academic institutions working to improve a policy and practice. And for the dashboard developments, I wanted to, well, just explain how we approach this. So we held community workshops here to identify responsible research assessment practices and also to categorize the types of source materials for the dashboard. And it's clear, of course, that institutions are at very different stages of readiness for research assessment reform. They've also implemented new practices in a variety of different ways and in different disciplines and at different levels. So this dashboard does try to capture the depth and also breadth of the process and the progress made by making a good start, by building a solid infrastructure that can actually grow and extend beyond its first iteration. So hopefully that will actually also be very helpful for regions across the world. So when we held these workshops, people were also asked to really explore and discuss how the practices fell into a couple of broad categories you see here on the slide, including also openness and open research. So that was a really interesting exercise also because, of course, some things don't really fall squarely within one type of box. So as a result, we opted for a very flexible and broadly applicable system of categorization in the dashboard using meta tagging. So this will also help because it allows policies to have multiple meta tags and you can find them in different ways. I also really want to encourage you to contribute if you want. We have a very first rough design for the dashboard. We have a lot of information, but of course there's much more out there than we're probably aware of. So if you really want to be included or your institution does good things, please feed that into the process and attend our events or concretely email my colleague Alex Rushforth, and his email is on the slide, and I also can share this afterward. Well, this all sounds very, very nice and very chippy, of course, but we're also not naive. Of course, there's also a lot of resistance to change. And this resistance, you probably know it, you live it, you feel it. It's often driven by concerns about, well, for instance, maintaining quality in the assessments, and people really ask, so how robust is all this? How reliable are new paradigms? How reliable are new methods? And of course, also for those researchers who are well rewarded by the current evaluation system, there's little incentive to change. But these people and also the gatekeepers and senior leadership, they need to really be involved and really need to step up. What's also a real challenge is the move away, still a big challenge, move away from bad metrics, simplistic uses of metrics, rankings, a focus on past success. So this is also why I think we shouldn't only focus on the coalitions of the willing and focus on educating or facilitating early career academics to show them how it's actually done, to show us how it's actually done, but also to really focus on those harder cases and the gatekeepers and senior leadership, and they really also need to foster these cultural changes. This is also why I'm actually happy, and this is, I think, the last slide or one of the last slides, that this is actually happening, this slide. So in the past year, I was part of an international scoping group set up by the Global Young Academy, the Inter-Academy Partnership, International Science Council. So in a sense, you could say this is the global elite. This steering group was asked to advise the three partner organizations on how they could together also add value to existing efforts to reform research evaluation by funders, of course, and by governments, and also by other significant actors. And we went through a very interesting regional consultation process. We also considered many major international events and developments in research evaluation. And then we came up with a couple of scenarios that I unfortunately can't share yet, but I'm really happy to say that the willingness to engage and trying to affect change also within the organizations themselves was really high. So I would say watch this space, and whenever I am at liberty to share more, I will absolutely do so. Last slide. So the horizon, this global view that I think the initiatives that I spoke about, and there's many more out there, of course, this global view is really needed, and it should look beyond how science is currently organized, how science is currently assessed. This system can really no longer afford to only look at how countries or how fields should, for instance, approach competition or focus on the horizon now, but it should really focus on what we'll be faced with in the coming century. We're going to be faced with, and are already faced with, a number of very big challenges for which we will urgently need new scientific knowledge that is openly available and that everyone can contribute to. So the point is not what scientific system do we need now, but which system do we need tomorrow for the challenges of tomorrow? And how do we build a sustainable scientific system also for the next generation? And I think open research and research assessment, responsible research assessment, are crucial to help build that system. Thank you very much. I'll leave it at that and enjoy the rest of the conference.
We have 10 minutes for questions for Sarah. Thomas, I think you can share the Mentimeter for us. Maybe I can just take presenter's privilege, though, Sarah, and ask you the first one. Cosmetic appropriation. And I think we've all seen it, that institutions very quick to sign up to DORA, and what it actually means in practice, even if they eradicate it mentioning the GIF in their policies, are they actually doing anything to make sure that it's not brought up in the room when decisions are made? So I just wonder if you could say more about the kind of work that you're doing to kind of narrow down on this.
Yeah, that's one of the really the harder cases, I guess. We've seen, and you've maybe also seen, a discussion over the summer that happened after one of the Dutch universities explicitly stepped away from using the GIF in formal policies, and it really exploded. So I guess it's a very wicked problem, because as I've also seen in my own research about the uses of indicators in research practice, in some disciplines, it is so interwoven with the entire research process, from the point of deciding what type of project you're going to develop, to which questions, to which types of collaborators, etc., up until the more obvious point around choosing what outlets to pick for your work. So it's also very difficult. It won't suffice if we say, okay, remove the journal impact factor from formal assessment procedures. We need to do much more. We need to really talk with researchers and talk about how do you develop a project, and who gets to think with you about the relevant questions, and for whom is it? Can we open this up again? And how does it relate to the research missions or the goals, the higher purpose of the work? And I sometimes get the feeling that we've unlearned to ask those types of questions. Also in leadership positions. So we've become so accustomed to outsourcing those types of things to externalized indicators and systems of assessment that focus on these more externalized metrics. And we've also contributed in Leiden, I think, partly to that dynamic. But I think trying to build the balance in the formal assessment context is important in trying to do that, but we're also, and I think that is something that this community and the open research community also is very good at, is to open up this question about who's it for and what is it for. And so part of the discussion around open research can be, in my view, a bit limiting or a bit focused too much on method and on kind of internal scientific dynamics. But it's, for me, it's really about what's this research for and who's included and excluded.
Thank you. Taking a question from the screen, what steps are needed to assess the intended and unintended effects of implementing the UNESCO recommendation? So you talked about the recommendations will go into this next phase. And I was also wondering if you could say a little bit more about what that would entail. And then maybe also kind of also this element of assessing intended and unintended effects, which might come from this kind of critical policy implementation, please.
That's a very big question, but it's a good one.
You have 7 minutes.
Yeah, because there's no one single answer, obviously. So maybe a disclaimer about the uses of the terminology of intended and unintended effects. I've always struggled a little bit with those terminologies because it implies that someone, and there's this grand design, and that's the one frame, and then there's a right and a wrong way of implementing that, and that is a bit, well, that's comforting, but it's not really how it works, I guess, because we have to consider context and we have to consider why is such a complex, multifaceted and multi-stakeholder and multi-everything issue. But when I focus on the pillar 5 and on the research assessment side, which I probably know best, I think what would really be needed is to design experiments, but first maybe also to collect on a global level good practices that work in these different contexts, and to learn from each other, to do mutual learning exercises on that scale hasn't happened yet. So that would be one thing. And I think then we can also, that would be my inclination to do that, to set up a space for learning and experimenting and also failing, which is difficult because there are huge stakes. But I think we don't know the answers in advance. We know the norms and values. Well, that's a good question, by the way. I don't know if we all share the same norms and values, but I think we know what doesn't work. So we can start to think about what could work, and there are already good practices out there. So I would be really interested in trying to set up experiments with multiple stakeholders, and that will take a couple of years. But I think that is one of the ways forward.
Great, thank you. Another question, you referred to the experience, especially in the Netherlands, and I think at one point you also talked about kind of controversies and pushback.
Yeah.
So one of the questions here, your perspective on the experiments with assessment reform underway in the Netherlands, what's working well, what concerns you have?
Yeah. What is really amazing is that that there's this coalition that is the entire ecosystem, in a sense, that said collectively, so the funders, the universities, the academic medical centers, all said, okay, we need to do this differently together. So that's really nice, and it's really an interesting experiment, and it's really now starting to be implemented in different universities and also with the funders. I'm concerned about the slippage that sometimes happens, maybe sometimes strategically, about what the issues are that we're actually trying to do differently. So I'm concerned that when there's debate, it's actually about something else. It's actually about funding for research. And it's actually about the move toward more mission-oriented research and the move away from funding for basic research. And there's a link in the debates with the quantitative metrics. So that's sometimes used strategically. We can't use those types of metrics, but we need those in our basic research fields, because that's the objective way of doing it. And then the point is actually about funding and infrastructure for basic research. Whilst I think this movement is broader, it's also about openness, and it's about creating a level playing field in the way we assess and contextualize research. So it has a tendency, or it could become a very tricky fight between natural sciences and parts of the biomedical sciences on the one hand, and the social sciences and humanities on the other hand. It's a very long story, but that's a concern I have, and I hope we don't get there.
Okay, great. There's fantastic questions here, and I want to ask you them all, but I think we only have time for one more. Maybe this one, because I think this goes to the within On-MERRIT kind of even once we have open science, there won't be full equity of opportunity to engage, because you need these prior competences and resources. So in order to achieve a global open science mandate, to what extent is it necessary to advocate for access to the internet as a human right? Are those things in the same conversation? And maybe more broadly about the basic digital divide and how this will continue to shape possibilities of participation in an open science world.
Absolutely. I think that is actually something that is specified and addressed in the UNESCO recommendation. It's very, very important, and it plays out in many, many ways that we don't have time to discuss right now, including the uses of certain web interfaces and metrics and all the links with research information systems. And I think this indeed we should advocate, and that happens in the UNESCO recommendation. That is, from the start, we didn't have any discussion about how broad we should try to phrase this recommendation, including that element. So I think it is in the same conversation, to be honest. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. I'm afraid we don't have more time, but we'd like to thank you really very much for giving us your presentation today. This has been really valuable. And online, I still don't think Zoom has sorted out how to do a round of applause yet.
Thank you for all the questions.
Everybody does a round of applause in their mind. Thank you very much.
Thanks.